welcome back to Black Bear News. Please remember to like this video and to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. Bleep, blop, blurp. I just made that sound because my computer just did some digital glitching. Don't know if that showed up on the screen or not. I'm going to read this article from Counterpunch by Robert Hunziker from November 8th, 2019. Ignoring Climate Catastrophes. Some recently on Facebook, or was it on Facebook? I don't know, somewhere. Maybe it was in the comment section. I guess the name of this channel popped up on a list of channels that somebody was like somebody's favorite channels or whatever. And that was cool. I was happy to be included in the list, but some of the channels listed said NTH or NTE believes in near-term human extinction or promotes. For one, nobody ever promotes human extinction. At least that I know. I'm not promoting human extinction. I just believe that it's very likely. If we don't, do something different, right? If we just do the same thing, likely extinction. And then the other thing it said was reads articles, which I think is funny because pretty much every channel, every news channel reads articles, every single one. They're like, look at this article here, or here's this study. Paul Beckwith reads articles, literally will read an entire article or a study. But somehow that was the only, that was only assigned to my channel, whatever that means. I do plenty of both. I read articles and I give commentary and I cover lots of different things. So, whatever. I just didn't take that personally. I just thought that was interesting. That's what they had to say about this channel. I just read articles. Anyways, I'm going to read this article. Ha, ha, ha. The planet is coming apart at the seams right before the eyes of scientists at work in remote fringe areas of the north where permafrost crumbles and collapses. It's abrupt climate change at work in real time, but the governing leaders of the world either don't care or don't know. If they did, there would already be a worldwide climate Marshall Plan to save civilization from early warning signals of utter chaos. Across 9 million square miles at the top of the planet, climate change is writing a new chapter. Arctic permafrost isn't thawing gradually as scientists once predicted. Geologically speaking, it's thawing almost overnight. After all, collapsing permafrost is the leading edge of a cataclysmal global warming as it precedes additional catastrophes that follow one after another and then another, all of which happen unannounced, known as abrupt climate change events. I didn't see that coming. The modern world's first near catastrophe, the ozone hole, 1980s, was luckily avoided 40 years ago. More on this fascinating story later. It was the planet's closest brush with near total extinction ever since the Permian-Triassic event took down 95% of all life 252 million years ago. Meanwhile, the concern is whether cascading permafrost will end up as the world's second near catastrophe, meaning it gets attended to, or it will lead to something much worse, as in catastrophes that follow one after another and then another. Cherski, Russia, which is home to the Northern Science Station at 69 latitude north, far above the Arctic Circle, is a year-round base for an international research station that studies Arctic biology and climate change. It is 60 miles inland from the East Siberian Sea, another high-risk area in the Arctic. In January of 2018, something unheard of happened at Cherski. The topsoil that has maintained frozen permafrost for eons was not refreezing like it had every year for as long as records were kept. Oh my. Whereas January in Siberia is normally so brutally cold that human breath can freeze with a tinkling sound that locals refer to as the whisper of stars. 3 years ago, the temperature in the ground above our permafrost was minus 3 degrees Celsius, or minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Sergei Zimov, an ecologist, said. Then it was minus 2. Then it was minus 1. This year, the temperature was plus 2 degrees. You know what that means. The aforementioned example of abrupt climate change in Siberia is a beckoning out of the north, warning that the past 10,000 years of the Holocene era, earmarked by a Goldilocks wonder world, not too hot, not too cold, has ended as excessive heat tears apart regions of the planet piece by piece, thereby sounding the alarm and threatening comfy lifestyles in every country in existence today. But it is a warning signal. Is it a warning signal with a short fuse or a long fuse? Human-generated greenhouse gases have kicked nature into high gear, competing with humanity by emitting tons of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, even in the winter in Siberia above the Arctic Circle. It's earth-shattering news that should cause sleepless nights for the world leaders, but it doesn't alarm them. Otherwise, they'd already be taking emergency measures. They're not. As it happens, world leadership is sacrificing their constituencies, on the altar of fossil fuel profits and a brand of capitalism that recklessly consumes everything in sight. I know you guys find humor in my enunciation sometimes. Therefore, emphasizing consequences such as Alaska's North Slope has seen temperatures spike 11 degrees Fahrenheit in 30 years as temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 240 miles above the Arctic Circle, challenging Florida's balmy weather. Didn't we just read an article about that or see a story about that? Happening again and again. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change struggles to keep up with the ever faster climate change disaster scenarios that unfold right under their noses, the world's leadership looks like a herd of deer frozen in headlights. Meanwhile, the risk of excessive... got dive bombed on by a fly. Meanwhile, the risks of excessive global warming or heat is not properly understood by the public in the following double scary context. Large, abrupt climate changes have repeatedly affected much or all of the Earth, locally reaching as much as 10 degrees C change in 10 years. The source is from Richard Alley, if you guys are familiar with Richard Alley. That description of abrupt climate change, 10C in 10 years, by Richard B. Alley, Evan Pugh, professor, Penn State University, is based upon paleoclimate data. However, the same risk is not considered by the IPCC or included in scientists' model, thus it qualifies as one of the least expected climate events. But it has happened in the past more than once. Frankly, society can't handle 10C in 10 years, whether locally, as stated by Dr. Alley, or universally. Which prompts the daunting notion of what happens when nature is goosed up by the sudden advent of the human meat machine. 7,500,000,000 people, 1,400,000,000 cars, 22,500,000 commercial vehicles, 3,500,000 heavy trucks, 425,000 buses, 39,000 commercial and military airplanes, 62,500 power plants, 996 million cattle, all simultaneously emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as CO2 emissions set new records year after year after year. In all, 80 to 90% of the above listed statistics occurred in only 70 years, whereas it took modern humans nearly 200,000 years to reach 2 billion in population. Today, it's the great acceleration at work as post-World War II, 5.5 billion newbies foraged the planet, or nibble, as some like to say, all within one lifetime. Amazing. Astounding. As a result, we are the biggest experiment the planet has ever encountered. Meanwhile, scientific knowledge that establishes a firm link between carbon dioxide emissions and excessive global heat brings forth far-reaching unknowns for today's carbon dioxide-fueled world. As such, the climate status integrity of the planet has become a gamble, a crapshoot. For example, the temperature-CO2 relationship over the past 400,000 years is sawtoothed, as demonstrated so clearly in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, 2006, when CO2 hits a high of 280 parts per million, temperatures like clockwork increase by 5C, hot cycle. And when CO2 hits a low of 180 parts per million, like clockwork, temperatures decrease by minus 5C, cold cycle, every 100,000 years over the past 400,000. Although temperature change, the wild card, is all about timing, meaning does it take centuries or decades or years for temperature to react to CO2 levels in the atmosphere? In that regard, Dr. Alley's 10C in 10 years is not encouraging, but nobody knows for sure what will happen tomorrow. Speaking of which, today's CO2 at 410 parts per million has powered through nature's rhythmic cycles of 180 low and 280 high over the past 400,000 years. Now what? Assuming global warming reacts accordingly, one possible scenario in a 4C world in which local temperature increases of 5 to 10 degrees will affect many areas, the impact on food production may be catastrophic. Today's collapsing permafrost is eerily similar to the circumstances that surrounded the world's first near catastrophe, the notorious ozone hole, as explained in Chapter 5, the first near catastrophe of Ian Angus's profoundly brilliant and indispensable book. The world has already faced that first near catastrophe and luckily got through it. Similar to ignoring abrupt climate change today, back in the 1970s and 80s, no one predicted the speed and magnitude of the steep decline in levels of ozone because of the damage of CFCs produced by DuPont ever since the 1930s. In fact, back in the day, NASA had predicted that ozone levels might decline 5 to 9% by 2050. But surprise, surprise, ozone levels dropped by 60% by the mid-1980s. Scientists were dumbfounded and scared. Without the protective ozone layer 10 to 20 miles above the Earth, which absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, life literally burns to a crisp. In a masterful stroke of good luck, a handful of scientists brought the impending disaster of the ozone hole to the attention of the world community. If not for the British Antarctic Survey that worked on a shoestring budget of $18,000 a year, the world wouldn't have known of the threat to all humanity. Since 1957, they monitored the ozone layer from the Halley Bay Observatory in Antarctica, but never suspected human-generated chemicals would attack and destroy the ozone layer. Excuse me. For 50 years, the CFC industry was able to avoid a ban on sales of CFCs due to the absence of hard scientific data showing a decline in ozone levels. In 1979, DuPont officials said no ozone depletion has ever been detected despite the most sophisticated analysis. All ozone depletion figures to date are computer projections based on a series of uncertain assumptions. Sound familiar? Similar to CO2 in the atmosphere today, CFCs had been entering the atmosphere in ever-increasing amounts since the early 1930s. The pre-1980 measurements from Halley Bay undoubtedly included their effect on the ozone layer above Antarctica, but in 1979, what had been a gradual linear process crossed a tipping point, becoming rapid and non-linear, thus giving birth to an abrupt climate change event that could have destroyed life on Earth. Some say the ozone layer is not fixed yet and that we are being baked by UV rays and that, that process is still ongoing. Anyways, it saved, thus giving birth to the abrupt climate change event that could have destroyed life on Earth. Thankfully, the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer was signed in 1987. It saved the world from surefire destruction, blindsided by its own chemical devices. After reviewing the history of CFCs and the ozone layer, Paul Crutzen, Nobel Prize-winning atmospheric chemist, commented, "I can only conclude that mankind has been extremely lucky." Now, is permafrost collapse the second near catastrophe or something worse? Hopefully the answer is not something worse, because dissimilar to the ozone hole crisis, which was solved by a handful of companies and industries implementing a technical fix and banning CFCs, the process of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions is universal, requiring decades of transforming the global economy, a gargantuan task when compared to the civilization's first near catastrophe. Similar to the ozone hole, which hit a tipping point 40 years after CFCs began emitting, collapsing permafrost first happens by inches, then by feet, then by portions of miles. When it is finally recognized as exceeding a tipping point, likely what's happening today in Siberia and throughout the far reaches of the northern hemisphere, where massive levels of permafrost cover 25% of the hemisphere, buried in frozen soil for eons, holding more than twice the amount of greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere. Dun, dun, dun. Permafrost collapse is as alarming, maybe more so, as the ozone hole threat. but only a handful of scientists see it and believe it. Sound familiar? Thank you so much for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. I hope you enjoyed that article. Don't forget, tomorrow is the live stream at 1 p.m. Pacific time. So hope to see you then. And also, don't forget the gas strike on Friday. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until next time, peace.